that they bring every week is so tremendous, and it's such a blessing. You guys can have a seat. Today I am concluding the series that we've been in called The Cure. And my message today is called The Cure for a Busted, Broken Life. Anybody here ever play with a Rubik's Cube? Yeah, a few people. Anybody ever have luck solving the Rubik's Cube? Yeah, a handful of you did. When I was a kid, the Rubik's Cube came out, and it was the hot item. And I remember Christmas morning, I went downstairs and I got a Rubik's Cube, and I played with it all day long. My cousins came over, they had one, we played with it all day long. I played with it all week, I played with it all month, and the problem was I never figured out how to solve it. So about that time, there began to be reports on the news about kids who could solve it in minutes. And then they began to have a tournament, where people came together and they were trying to crown the Rubik's Cube champion. And I quickly came to realize that I was not going to be the Rubik's Cube champion. So I went in my room and I took all the stickers off and I put them all back on. I solved it, right? At least until I began to play with it a little more and got it to a state where I couldn't fix it again. So I couldn't solve it. And a friend of mine told me, hey, you can actually take the thing apart and then put it back together in the right order. So I took it apart and I put it back together, and it was solved until I played with it again and I couldn't figure out how to solve it. So I took it apart another time, and I must have broken a piece when I took it apart because I couldn't get it back together. So it just laid there in the floor of my room in a bunch of busted, broken pieces until my parents made me clean my room up, at which time I threw it in the trash can, which meant it ended up in the bottom of a landfill somewhere. But I would imagine that every single one of us at some point in time in our life have felt just like that Rubik's Cube, busted up and broken, and so many pieces on the ground. You don't know how to fix yourself. No one can tell you how to fix yourself. Busted up and broken. The thing is, we got really good. We've been broken for so long that we've gotten really good at putting bandages over the wounds, hiding it, putting on what I like to call our Sunday best. We show up for work, we show up for church, and someone asks us how we're doing. Man, I'm walking on sunshine. I couldn't be doing any better. But the truth is on the inside, we're hurting. We're broken. We're shattered into so many pieces. The problem with that is the smallest amount of unresolved brokenness can cause the entire structure to collapse if it's not dealt with. I want you to take a look at this picture. You see anything wrong with this picture? This is in Shanghai, China, and they built this building. It's in the complex there with several other buildings. And when they built it, they determined that it was structurally sound and that they were at some point going to be ready to allow people to move into it. Well, they decided they wanted to build an underground parking deck next door. And so they began to dig, and as they began to dig, they cracked the foundation, but they didn't know it, so they continued to dig. And eventually, the foundation gave way, and the entire building collapsed. You see, we are made in God's image, and just like He is a three-part being, we are too. We have flesh, we have a soul, we have a spirit. And when these wounds that we have, when they go deeper than our flesh, they injure our soul, they injure our spirit, and we're broken on the inside. And if you will bear with me, our foundation is cracked. And if we don't figure out how to heal that brokenness, our entire structure will live our life on the verge of collapse. Today, we're going to talk about Peter. And as we talk about Peter, there are two things I want you to take from this today. I can't count, sorry. There are two things I want you to take from this today. Number one, no one is immune to brokenness. If you look through the Bible and look through all of the greatest heroes of our faith, you will see that at some point in time in their life, they experienced brokenness. And if you're here today and you say, hey, I haven't been broken, keep living. And I'm telling you, you will experience brokenness. The second thing I want you to take away today is that because of Jesus, there is always hope. It doesn't matter how long you've been broken. It doesn't matter how many times you've been broken. It doesn't matter if you've been broken because of your own mistakes or if it's a situation, circumstance that someone else thrust upon you. There's always hope because of Jesus. So let's take a look at Luke chapter 22. We're going to read verses 54 through 62. And I want to set this up for you. This is just before Jesus is convicted and led off to be crucified. And if you read earlier in the gospel, you see where he had a conversation with Peter, where he told Peter that he would betray him 3 times before the rooster crowed. So let's read this. It says, so they arrested him and led him to the high priest's home. And Peter followed at a distance. The guards lit a fire in the middle of the courtyard and sat around it, and Peter joined them there. A servant girl noticed him in the firelight and began staring at him. Finally, she said, this man was one of Jesus' followers. But Peter denied it. Woman, he said, I don't even know him. After a while, someone else looked at him and said, you must be one of them. No, man, I am not, Peter retorted. About an hour later, someone else insisted, this must be one of them because he is a Galilean too. But Peter said, man, I don't know what you are talking about. And immediately, while he was still speaking, the rooster crowed. At that moment, the Lord turned and looked at Peter. Suddenly, the Lord's words flashed through Peter's mind. Before the rooster crows tomorrow morning, you will deny 3 times that you even know me. And Peter left the courtyard weeping bitterly. Listen, if there was ever anybody, since the world began, if there was ever anybody that had a moment where they thought they had completely blown it, they had completely ruined it, where they reached total brokenness, it was Peter at that moment. Because you got to realize, Peter had been given the opportunity of a lifetime to walk beside, to walk stride for stride, to walk on the water with God's only son. And because he probably feared persecution at that time, when he was given the opportunity to declare that he was one of his disciples, blew it. It says he went away weeping bitterly. He found himself at a place of brokenness. All of us can probably look back and we can find that moment in our life and say, yeah, that was the moment at which I was broken. We can, whether it's our own actions or something someone else has done to us, that was the moment in which I was broken, which I was shattered, and I don't know how to put myself back together. So what's the cure? The cure is restoration. Restoration is defined as a bringing back to a former position or condition. Bringing back to the state you were in prior to that moment of brokenness. Now, I'm not talking about Sunday best. I'm talking being made whole. So today I want to give you what I'm calling 3 steps on the path to restoration. 3 steps. The first step is believe the restorer can restore you. Believe the restorer can restore you. When I was a young kid, my father had a 69 and a half Mustang Fastback. Yeah, see, some of you went, oh, yeah, such a cool car. I thought it was the greatest car ever. It had an 8-track cassette in it. You know what I'm talking about? The 8-track probably 8 more cassettes than it actually played, but it had an 8-track cassette player in it. And one day he was traveling. We lived in Peachtree City. He was going to Fayetteville. And the front wheel of the car came off. And so he ended up in a ditch, which left the car in a state where it was in need of restoration. Now, my father is not a restorer of cars. So he sold the car to a gentleman who had the intention of restoring it to a usable state. And I've always said that if I had the opportunity to purchase a car that I could afford to allow to sit in my garage and only drive on Sunday afternoons, I would buy a classic Mustang, because to this day, I still think it's the coolest car ever. But what has prevented me from even attempting to buy a car is that if I were to purchase a classic Mustang in need of restoration, it would still be sitting in my yard in need of repair, because I am not a restorer of cars. I don't know how to do it. So let me ask this question. How foolish of you would it be for you to purchase a classic car, bring it to my house, park it in my driveway, and say, hey, I'm just going to leave this here until you fix this, and I'll come pick it up? Right? You would probably go to your grave, and that car would still be sitting in my driveway, because I am not a restorer of cars. So let me ask this question. Why is it that when we find ourselves hurting, we find ourselves broken, we often turn to YouTube to find the latest, self-help video, find the latest self-help guru? Jesus is not a restorer. He is the restorer of souls. His daddy holds the blueprint. His daddy was the author, the creator, and he alone can restore our souls. Look at what David says in Psalm 23, verses 2 through 3. He says, he. So who is he referring to? He was referring to God the Father, Son, Holy Spirit. He said, he makes me. I don't think you have bulletins. I was going to tell you to underline that, but we didn't give you a bulletin, did we? He makes me. Hold on to those three words. He makes me lie down in green pastures. He leads me beside still waters, and he restores my soul. Listen, oftentimes when we find ourselves broken, we go to God and we fall on our knees and we ask him to fix us, to heal us. And what we want is instant gratification. We want, from the time that we fall on our knees and rise up, for God to restore us, to take us back to that moment before our brokenness. And don't get me wrong, we serve a miracle-working God, and I've seen him do that in people's lives. But most of the time, it doesn't work that way. Most of the time, it's a process. Restoration is a process. It takes time. You know what? And for some of us, we have to revisit that process multiple times. Some of us revisit it monthly. Some of us revisit it weekly. Some of us revisit it every moment of our day. It's a process. That's why it says, he makes me lie down. Sometimes God has to sit us down. Sometimes God has to take us and he has to drag us to the place where our striving to heal ourselves ceases. He has to take us to the place where his voice is the only voice that we can hear. Take us to the place where his voice is the loudest voice, because it is his voice and his words alone that can restore us and that can heal us. When I was working on this message on Thursday, I was in my living room and I had the television on the Weather Channel. The hurricane had come ashore. And the loudest voice in the room was Jim Cantori's voice, because wherever there's a disaster, there he is. And I found I had to turn it off because I couldn't focus on God's voice because his voice was louder. Sometimes God has to make us lie down in green pastures, take us to the place where we can be restored. Your restoration is a priority to God. That's why he drags us kicking and screaming to the still waters. It's a priority. It's important to him because he has a purpose for you. And if you remain in your brokenness, you might not achieve that purpose. We're going to continue to look at Peter's story. But first I want to, in Hebrews 13:8, it says that Jesus is the same yesterday, today, and forever. And the reason I tell you that scripture is because the greatest predictor that we have of how Jesus will operate in our lives is what he did in the past. Because it says he's the same as he was yesterday. So I want to look at Peter's story, and I want you to see how God makes your restoration a priority. So we're going to take a look at John chapter 21, verses 15 through 17. Now, let me set this up. This was after Jesus had gone to heaven. No, yes, this is after he had risen from the grave. And if you read through the Gospels, you find there are several times where he appears to people. And this is one of those times. The disciples had gone fishing. They were out in a boat, and they hadn't caught any fish. And a figure appeared to them on the shore. And he asked them if they'd caught any fish. He said, no. He said, put your nets on the other side of the boat. And they caught more fish than they could ever imagine. But then all of a sudden, Peter realized that the figure on the shore was Jesus. It says he wrapped his garment around him, jumped in the water, and ran to him. And when they got to the shore, Jesus had been preparing a meal for him. It was cooking over a fire, it said. And then it says this. It says, after breakfast, Jesus asked Simon Peter, Simon, son of John, do you love me more than these? Yes, Lord, Peter replied. You know I love you. Then feed my lambs, Jesus told him. Jesus repeated the question, Simon, son of John, do you love me? Yes, Lord, Peter said. You know I love you. Then take care of my sheep. Jesus said a third time and asked him, Simon, son of John, do you love me? Peter was hurt that Jesus asked the question a third time. He said, Lord, you know everything. You know that I love you. Jesus said, then feed my sheep. Do you see what Jesus did there? He knew that he was about to leave earth and go be with his Father. But yet he purposefully came, took Peter aside, and restored him to ministry. Because, look, earlier in the Gospels, you see where Jesus had told him that Peter was the rock that he was going to build the church on. He had set a plan in place. And he knew that if he left Peter there in that state of brokenness, that he might not step into the plan that God called him to. So he came back purposefully and made it a priority to restore Peter. Listen, God makes it a priority to restore you. He will meet you right in the midst of your brokenness and put you back together because he has a plan for you and he needs you to be whole. And if you remain in a broken state, you might not step into the plan and the purpose that he has for you. Step number 2 is don't believe the adversary. Don't believe the adversary. Anybody in here have a favorite sports movie? Got a few of them? Yeah, I love sports movies. And my favorite sports movie is Remember the Titans, right? Second close. It's close second is Facing the Giants. But I can't watch that movie. It makes me cry every time. So, but Remember the Titans is my absolute favorite sports movie. And I love sports movies because in sports movies, there's always a clearly defined underdog who's got to overcome some huge obstacle in order to be victorious. And there's always a clearly defined adversary. And I love the scene in Remember the Titans where Coach Yost realizes that they're fighting two adversaries. They're fighting the former state champ, but they're also fighting the refs that have colluded together to prevent them from being victorious. And I love it. He goes to the huddle, and his defense is on the field, and he says, look, I don't want them to gain another yard. I do not want them to cross the line of scrimmage. And then he says, leave no doubt. And I love this. He says, make them remember the day that they played the Titans. Man, that's awesome. Because you know that's the turning point. You know that's the moment that the underdog is going to rise up and he's going to defeat the adversary, right? Let's look at what Peter says. Chapter 5, verse 8. Peter says, be sober, be vigilant. He says, you know what? Whether you believe it or not, whether you know it or not, there is another force at work here. The brokenness, the things that you're experiencing, it's not just bad luck. It's not just by chance. There's another force at work here. He says, because your adversary, and then he clearly defines the adversary, the devil, as a roaring lion walketh about, seeking whom he may devour. The other thing I love in sports movies is that there's always a moment where the adversary begins to taunt. You know, you're not good enough. I'm stronger than you. You're not fast enough. We have more championships. And do you know the purpose of that taunting? It's to convince you that you cannot defeat him, right? And I believe that our adversary, the devil, does the exact same thing. I believe he takes us out to a place and he breaks us. And then I believe he collects those broken pieces, and every time you try to pick yourself up off the ground, he rattles it to remind you that, hey, you're still an addict. And every time you begin to take a step to restoring yourself, healing, he goes, you're still worthless. You're still broken. And the problem is that we get so accustomed to that sound of him reminding us that we're broken that it really kind of becomes the soundtrack of our life. And we allow those lies that he's telling us to shape us. We allow those lies that he's telling us to help us make decisions. And we begin to believe the lie. John 10:10 says, the robber comes only. He has one purpose. He has one purpose for everything that he does in our lives, and that is to steal, kill, and destroy. His one purpose is to thwart the plan that God has for your life. Only reason he's here. How many of you know that at the moment that Peter denied Jesus, Satan had to have gotten in his ear and been like, hey man, you're a pretty terrible disciple. I think you should go back to just being a fisherman, because there's no way that anybody else is going to want to follow this Jesus that you just denied. And if he had gotten Peter to believe the lie, to remain there, and if Jesus had not come back and restored him, maybe the plan that God had for him would not have been accomplished. Anybody know who Chris Tomlin is? Yeah, he's a Grammy Award-winning singer-songwriter, worship leader. We sing a lot of his songs. They say that on any given Sunday, 100,000 churches around the world are singing songs that Chris Tomlin wrote. And the story goes that when he was in school, that his teacher told him that he was not a very good singer and that was not a career that he should choose. But he went on to write songs like How Great Is Our God, which is one of my favorites. It's actually in the Baptist hymnal, which is enormous. And I love the song. We love the song. It goes, how great is our God. Sing with me, how great is our God. Oh, we'll see how great is our God. Sing that with me one time. How great is our God. Sing with me, how great is our God. Oh, we'll see how great is our God. Do you know at the moment that he was told that he was not good enough? It was the robber coming to steal, kill, and destroy. Because he knew that if he could get Chris to believe that lie. Chris actually went to college to study sports science before he says he realized that was not God's plan. But if he had believed the lie, believe me, the enemy knew that there would be 100,000 less churches singing about how great our God is on Sunday mornings. He comes to steal, kill, and destroy. Listen, it is not possible for you to believe what the adversary says about you and what the restorer says about you at the same time. So which are you going to choose to believe? When you wake up in the morning, are you going to choose to believe that you're still an addict? Or are you going to believe the restorer who says that you're a new creation and that you don't have to be what you were yesterday? You can be new today. Are you going to believe the lie that you're just worthless? Or are you going to believe that what the restorer says, where he says that he cares for you so much that he knows every hair on your head? Are you going to believe the lie that you're just a dirty old sinner who's doomed to spend eternity in hell with your adversary? Or are you going to believe that by grace you are forgiven, you are healed, and you are restored? I tell you what, I'm going to choose to believe my restorer. Because living a life believing the lies that my adversary tells me is such a tortured life. And I just can't live that way anymore. I have to choose to live in the freedom and the grace and the mercy that my restorer gives me so that I can be made whole. Step number 3 is that we have to believe that God has a plan for you and a purpose for your broken pieces. Believe God has a plan for you and a purpose for your broken pieces. We're going to look at Acts chapter 2, verse 40 through 41. And this is again Peter. And this is after Jesus has gone to heaven. And this is on the day of Pentecost where thousands of people have gathered. And it says, then Peter continued preaching. He gets up to preach a message for a long time, strongly urging all his listeners, save yourselves from this crooked generation. Those who believed what Peter said were baptized and added to the church that day, about 3,000 in all. How many of you would say that God had a plan for Peter? He had a plan to use Peter. Man, I could not imagine preaching a message and 3,000 people come to know Jesus at one time. He had a plan for Peter. God has a plan for you too. God has a plan to use you. Look, God had a plan for Peter. The adversary had a plan to thwart that plan, but God had a countermeasure, and that countermeasure was Jesus. And because of Jesus, 3,000 people came to be saved that day. God has a plan for you, but I know right in the midst of your brokenness, you may be asking, you may be thinking, hey, there's no way that God can use me. You don't know how many times I've messed up. You don't know where I've been. You don't know what I've done. There's no way that the Lord desires to use me. And our problem in that situation is that oftentimes the only measure of how much mercy God can give, the only measure we have is the amount of mercy that we can give, right? And we look and see, I've gone so far beyond the amount of mercy that I can give, there's no way that God can use me. But the amount of mercy that God is willing to give you has nothing to do with you. It has everything to do with the enormity of the love that he has for us and that he has for you. And God has a plan. He has a plan for you. It is a clearly defined plan, and it's laid out in what he calls the Great Commission. He says, go. He says, go into all the world and make disciples. But the question is, do you believe that Great Commission, do you believe that it only applies to those of us who are called to be pastors? Those who are called to be missionaries? Or do you believe it applies to you? Do you believe that he's calling you to go to your family members, your coworkers, and make disciples? Do you believe he has a plan for you? You say, yeah, he has a plan for me, but how in the world can he use me in the midst of my brokenness? Listen, we're going to look at 2 Corinthians chapter 1, verse 4. It says, he comforts. He comes to us. He restores us. And where does he do it? He comforts us in all of our troubles. But why does he do it? Does he do it just so that we can have a warm, fuzzy feeling? Now, granted, he's a loving God, and he wants us to be lifted up. He wants us to be encouraged. But he does it so that we can comfort others. When they are troubled, we will be able to give them the same comfort God has given us. God has a plan and a purpose for your broken pieces. He comes, just like he did with Peter. He restores us, and he restores us so that we can take that same message to someone else. Look, Your brokenness, the story of God restoring you, may be the very thing that saves someone else's life. I get to go to Celebrate Recovery every Thursday night. And this process is a key part of the Celebrate Recovery process. Every other week, we get to see testimonies. And I'm telling you, testimony after testimony of people whose lives have just been, shattered in ways that I could never have imagined. They've gone through things that I never have gone through and pray I never have to go through. But because of Jesus. Because Jesus met them in the midst of their brokenness, set them on a path of being restored, they're able to take that testimony, that story of Jesus restoring them, and use it to allow someone else to be restored. You should see it. People walk in the door for the first time, and you can tell they're new, and you can tell they're anxious, you can tell they're nervous. And it's because they think, I'm the only one. No one else has ever gone through this. My brother has experienced a lot of brokenness in his life. And I hope he doesn't get upset for me telling this. But he came to Celebrate Recovery with me this week for the first time. And I know, confidentiality, I shouldn't have told that, but I'm telling you, the conversation I had with him afterwards, he said he was feeling so much anxiety, and it was all because he felt like he was the only one. But now he knows we're all hurting and we're all broken, and that if we'll sit in the Lord's presence, he can restore us and bring us back to wholeness. I'm sorry. Sorry. If you're here today and you can admit that you're broken, there's a couple of things I'd like you to do. Number one, if you don't know him, if you don't have an account with the restorer, I would ask you to open an account with the restorer by asking him into your life, because knowing him is the first step. It's the most important step. Number two, be willing to allow him to take you to the place of green pastures. Take you to the place of quiet rest. Because his voice and his words are the only thing that can restore you. The only thing that can make you whole. And the third thing I'd like you to consider is Celebrate Recovery. Listen, there's not another ministry that we have that is more equipped to help you find restoration. Your Father loves you. He never intended for you to be broken, and he will meet you in your brokenness, and he will restore you. Let me pray for you. If you're here today and you don't know Jesus as your Savior, I want to give you that opportunity, because that is the first step. That is the most important step that you can take towards restoration. So you can just say this prayer to yourself: Father, I'm here today, and I'm in need of a Savior. I would ask that you come, live in my heart, begin the process of restoring me, God. Forgive me of my sins, Father. Help guide me every day from this moment forward. If you prayed that prayer, we would love to celebrate with you. If you prayed that prayer online, put in the chat, hey, I received Christ. David is on the chat with you on the online campus. He would love to celebrate with you there. Tell somebody. Let them know. Let them know that you are taking a step towards being made whole today. Father, I pray for all of us that are hurting and broken in this world, Father. I thank you that you love us so much that you will meet us in the midst of our brokenness. I pray that you will help us step into the plan that you have for us, that others may be set free, may be healed from their brokenness too, Father. It's hard for us to imagine the kind of love you have for us, but Father, we are so thankful and we are so grateful for it.